Some places are supposed to be built on a promise of justice, of rehabilitation. But what happens when that promise just completely shatters? When the very institutions that are designed to hold people accountable become these theaters of cruelty, where a person's humanity is just systematically stripped away? We're about to dive into some deeply disturbing cases that show a pattern of failure, and not just of a few bad apples, but of entire systems.
Want to die, want to be with dad. Too hard. These were the last words a 16-year-old boy said to his family over the phone. He was supposed to be in the care of a state-sanctioned institution. His words are just a haunting window into the stories we're about to explore. They're a reminder that behind every case file, there's a real person, a family, and a life that was cut tragically short. So, for our first section, we're going to look at how the most mundane everyday things, like taking a shower or getting medical care, can be twisted into actual instruments of torture. And these aren't just isolated incidents. They're terrifying examples of how a toxic environment can weaponize the routine. Okay, let's start with the case of Darren Rainey. He was a 50-year-old man dealing with schizophrenia, serving a short sentence down at Dade Correctional Institution in Florida. Now, after an incident that was directly related to his mental illness, guards took him to a specialized shower. But this was no ordinary shower. For him, it became a torture chamber. Just look at that number, 160 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, that's hot enough to cause third-degree burns in just a few seconds. For nearly 2 hours, Rainey was locked inside as the scalding water blasted down on him. He pounded on the door, he begged to be let out, but the guards, they just ignored his cries. The result was absolutely horrific. When paramedics finally arrived, they said his skin was literally peeling off his body. But despite this overwhelming, gruesome physical evidence, it took years to even get a real investigation. And then, in 2016, a medical examiner came back with a ruling that's just shocking. His death was accidental. They blamed his health problems and the confinement, basically ignoring the fact that he had been boiled alive. And this pattern of turning procedures into weapons, it isn't unique. Over in Germany, a medical process was turned into a state-sanctioned tool of interrogation. Lele Alamakande, an asylum seeker, was suspected of swallowing drugs. Instead of just waiting, police forced him to undergo this incredibly violent and invasive procedure. He fought back and he started to drown in his own vomit. But they just kept going, repeating the process until he collapsed. Lele Alamankande slipped into a coma and died 10 days later. And here's the thing. His death exposed a much, much bigger problem. It turns out this practice had been used on over 1,000 people in that one city alone. It took this man's tragic death for the European Court of Human Rights to finally step in and rule, without a doubt, that this procedure was torture. And this brings us to a really critical point. For this kind of extreme cruelty to even happen, the victim has to be dehumanized first. They have to be turned into something less than human in the eyes of their captors. In this next part, we're going to see exactly how that horrifying process works. This is Dilawar. He was a young taxi driver in Afghanistan who, back in 2002, just happened to pick up the wrong passengers at the absolute wrong time. He was near a U.S. base that had been attacked, and someone found a broken walkie-talkie in his car. And that was it. On that flimsy excuse, he was handed over to American soldiers, and his life was, for all intents and purposes, over. At the Bagram Detention Center, Dilawar was put through days of hell. He was chained by his wrists to the ceiling, to the point where his shoulders dislocated from the strain. But the most systematic part of the abuse was what the soldiers called peroneal strikes. He was forced to endure over 100 of these powerful, debilitating blows to his legs. The word that doctors use to describe his leg tissue says everything you need to know. Pulpified. Let that sink in. His legs were so completely destroyed that if he had somehow survived, amputation would have been the only option. And the most gut-wrenching part of this whole story, interrogators later admitted they believed Dilawar was innocent the entire time. This process of dehumanization is just especially horrific when the victim is a child. Nicholas Contreras was only 16 years old when he was sent to a place called the Arizona Boys Ranch. He had asthma, and because of the high elevation, he got sick almost immediately. Fever, nausea, he was losing a ton of weight. But instead of getting medical care, Nicholas was systematically broken down. The staff just dismissed his illness. They called him a faker, a baby. They actually denied him his prescribed inhaler. They forced him through these brutal exercises, even punching him when he couldn't keep up. He got so sick he often couldn't control his bladder or his bowels, and he was forced to sleep on his own soiled mattress in a bathroom. After collapsing over and over again during another round of forced drills, a staff member stood over him and ordered him to get up one last time. And his final word, it was a simple act of defiance. No. He was pronounced dead just 2 hours later. This wasn't neglect. This was a sustained campaign of abuse against a very sick child.
So what's the thread that connects all of these horrifying stories? It's not just the cruelty itself, but what happens, or rather what doesn't happen afterwards. It's the consistent, frustrating, and just infuriating failure of the system to hold anyone truly accountable. This pattern of impunity is maybe the most disturbing part of this entire picture. Take the case of Abdul Wali. He was a 28-year-old Afghan farmer who actually went to a U.S. base voluntarily to try and clear his name. Instead, he was tortured by a CIA contractor for 2 straight nights. The beating was so severe it broke his pelvis that by the second night, he was no longer pleading for mercy. He was begging to be killed. And this is where you just see the justice gap laid bare. Darren Rainey, boiled alive. His death was ruled an accident. No criminal charges. Abdul Wali, beaten to death. His killer was only convicted of assault and served less than 7 years. The soldiers who pulpified Dilawar's legs, they faced only minor punishments. In not one of these cases was anyone ever convicted of murder. So, what happens when this lack of accountability isn't just a failure of the system, but it becomes official state policy? Well, then you get a place like Sednaya prison in Syria. Former inmates gave it a nickname, the human slaughterhouse. And they said it wasn't a place designed to hold people, it was a place designed specifically to break them. The atrocities that were documented at Sednaya are almost unbelievable. New arrivals were given welcome parties, which were just brutal beatings. Torture with pipes, cables, electricity, that was a daily routine. But the ultimate horror was the system of secret mass hangings. After sham trials that lasted only minutes, groups of up to 50 people were executed at a time. Amnesty International estimated that up to 13,000 people were killed there in just a 4-year period. And that really leads us to the heart of the matter. We only know about these cases because of brave whistleblowers, determined journalists, and human rights groups who fought like hell to bring these stories into the light. These stories are the exceptions that prove a really terrifying rule. These stories, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're the ones that, against all odds, somehow manage to escape the walls of secrecy. And that forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. For every Darren Rainey, for every DeLavar, for every Nicholas Contreras whose story we now know, how many more are out there, lost forever in the silence?